Last week we started in the book of Judges, and we started a little bit into the book of Judges in Judges 4 with the judge Deborah. If you weren't here last week, judge at this time is not like what we would consider a judge. It is essentially a leader. Joshua had just died, and the people of Israel didn't have a leader, and so they went through this cycle, and we talked about this cycle that they would go through, and it was the Israelites would break God's covenant by worshiping other gods, and then foreign enemies would oppress the Israelites. Then the Israelites would cry out to God for help. Then God would raise up a judge, a leader, to save the people. The judge delivers the people, leads them back to the covenant. The people remain faithful to God through the judge's lifetime, and then the judge dies and the Israelites begin to worship other gods. And so we see this cycle. And so there's a little interruption in the cycle, and I think from this interruption is where we can take our lesson here today as we talk about Gideon. And Gideon comes after Deborah. And so the story of Gideon, as the sermon title might let you know about, empowering and not enabling. If you see this cycle over and over and over again, for those of you who are parents, as I was blessed with a quick trip to visit my sister and her family real quick at the end of this week, and so I got to watch my sister mother her kids. And I noticed that they went through a similar cycle. They weren't worshiping other gods, but when they didn't get their way, sometimes they like to pout just a little bit. And so, but I watched my sister deal with her kids and work with her kids and didn't let them continue on in this cycle. She had to put a stop to it. And so we can picture God doing this in the story of Gideon with the people of Israel. Sometimes we long for a God who will simply enable us. It can be a little bit easier for us anyways that way. And by enable, I mean the phenomena where people will allow, tolerate, support, or underwrite the misbehavior of others. Enabling is a classic and very real concept in the world of addiction and recovery. It's behavior that's usually meant to help, but that actually does harm because it allows the addictive behavior to continue with no pressure to change. In the language of addiction and recovery, enabling means the non-addict becomes a codependent with the addict. The addict's problem becomes your problem. Addicts manipulate enablers into perpetuating and fueling their addiction, even to the point of accepting the blame. But enabling, while it includes addictive behavior, actually goes far beyond it. It's also the parents who keep giving an allowance to their 23-year-old son despite knowing that he's parked in the basement, hooked on his video games, and not trying to do anything. It's the abuser who makes his victim actually believe she deserves the abuse, and the victim who buys it. It's the person who keeps taking in her single friend who makes no attempt to restore order to her own life. It's the boss at work who tolerates, who disciplines, who manages around, but who never really releases an unqualified or underperforming employee. Enabling includes, but is not limited to, addiction. It's all around, and it happens all the time when we enable, allow, and tolerate, when we underwrite the harmful behavior of someone around us. Subconsciously or not, enabling is the kind of expectation that many of us bring to our conception of and our connection with God. We long for a God who will enable us. And I think of the people who, through the years, have come into my office asking for healing prayers over their compulsive behavior. And sometimes I wasn't quite sure how to help. And then I ran across a pastor, and he says this. And yet on many occasions, those same supplicants, those same people asking for help, have been strangely unwilling to enter into any sort of program, whether it be a 12-step or of another kind. Something tailored to bring them along to recovery from their struggles. These people, it seems, want God to do for them what God longs to do with them. He continues on, the people of Israel in the time of the judges had these same feelings. They wanted God to bail them out when they got in over their heads. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later how that story ends with his counseling. It's something that flipped around my thinking as a young pastor many years ago. But we see this cycle now kick up. God looks like they're going to have to bail out the Israelites once again. And so we see maybe this cycle is just going to continue. That same cycle we see at the end of Judges 5. And I mentioned real briefly, Judges 5 is a kind of a poetic version of Judges 4, really a celebration of what happened in Judges 4. And it's entitled in most Bibles just simply Deborah's Song. It's like a victory chant of sorts. And so chapter 5 ends with this great feeling. Israel's heading in the right direction. And then we get to chapter 6. And the first verse of chapter 6, we hear this in verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. They go from celebration, exhortation, just living the good life, and then all of a sudden, we see that now they're in the hands of the Midianites. Now that didn't last too long, did it? Peace for about 40 years, and then the Israelites begin the cycle again. Now the next 5 verses or so tell us about the Midianites oppressing the Israelites, and the Midianites were a nomadic people. They were a nomadic people, had no home, yet they were the ones who displaced the Israelites, the ones with the home, the God-given home. Not only do they take their homes, but they take their crops, they take what they own. So finally the people have had enough, they don't know what else to do. So then we pick up with verse 7. And we hear this. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. And so I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." So the cycle doesn't continue here, though. We see that God does something different. Oh, you cried out to me? Here's another judge. No, he doesn't send a judge, he sends a prophet. And it's an unnamed prophet, but it's a prophet nonetheless delivering this message to the Israelites. God sends this prophet, and the message comes in the form really of a history lesson. God reminded them of their agreement. You weren't supposed to worship any other gods. The Israelites didn't listen. Time and again they didn't listen, and God wasn't going to be codependent. God knew that Israel didn't need to be bailed out. They didn't need a reminder. God didn't come to their aid right away, but he had a plan. And like many other stories that involve God helping people overcome an obstacle, God's plan has its roots in an unlikely person. Judges 6 continues. We pick up then with verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And so that just to have that visual, a winepress is going to be underneath the ground, out of view. He's not in a barn, he's not out in the field threshing wheat. He's taken the time to get the wheat, get it down into the winepress, get himself down into the winepress, and go to work so that no Midianites see him. Verse 12, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and has given us into the hand of Midian." So Gideon's response isn't too unlike many of our responses in this time. If we were in Gideon's shoes, he's having to hide to do his chores, essentially. He's having to hide to harvest the crops to make sure that his family can eat. He's having to hide because of the Midianites, yet this angel comes and says, "Hey, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon says, "Wait, you said that the Lord is with us? I don't know if you have seen what's going around. I don't know if you've noticed that I'm down in this wine press having to hide to do my chores so the Midianites don't come and steal our food. I don't think the Lord is with us. The Lord hasn't been with us in some time. Our ancestors talked of these mighty things, but I don't think that the Lord is really with us." With all that's been happening, I don't think this is a line of questioning that's too far-fetched coming from a younger person. He's known nothing but oppression from the Midianites in his life. And of course, Gideon would be suspicious of someone saying that the Lord is with you. So then the back and forth continues with verse 14. We pick up, it says, "The Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?' "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family," or the youngest in my family. The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I will wait until you return." Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them under the oak tree. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with a tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. And when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." And to this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. I love the beginning, those first couple verses of this back and forth. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in strength, the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand, and I'm not sending you." He's trying to remind Gideon that he's already got strength within him. God created Gideon. God knows who Gideon is. God knows what Gideon is capable of. But does Gideon believe in God enough? Does Gideon believe in himself enough in this instance? And in Gideon, like so many others, Moses comes to my mind as the back and forth goes with Moses. When Moses is being called, he's got all these excuses laid out before him. "Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Pastor Talbot Davis, there's not too many people who write about the book of Judges, and so you're going to hear about the same guy, I think, throughout here and there, as he's done some good studies in the book of Judges. But Pastor Talbot Davis, he has these thoughts about Gideon's back and forth with the angel of the Lord, and he says, and I quote, "It's important to notice that God doesn't answer either of Gideon's questions. As with the people of Israel who cried out for a deliverer and God sent a prophet instead, God responds, but doesn't address what Gideon is asking about. See, I think the Lord realizes something because God is smart. Sometimes people ask questions not because they want answers, but because they want attention. They want control. They want to elicit a response, to set the stage for what the other party can do and win. So if God were to answer Gideon, God would be enabling him and the rest of Israel. So God doesn't answer. Instead, God says simply, you have strength, so go and rescue Israel from the power of Midian. Am I not personally sending you?" End of quote. Folks, Gideon already had the strength within him. All he had to do was trust in God and go. God's telling Gideon that everything else doesn't matter. The least being the least in the tribe of Manasseh, being the youngest of his family. Everything you need I've already placed within you. I created you. Go forward. So God gives Gideon a task, and he doesn't answer his question. He doesn't enable Gideon to just sit there and be directed. Gideon is empowered to go forward and use the skills that God's already placed within him. It's remarkable that what God says to Gideon, you have strength. You already have the resources. That is a powerful word for us because so often we already have everything we need in order to right the ship and begin to follow God. We already have the resources to live our faith with integrity and to engage in remarkable ministry, if only we will act on them. There was once a pastor, and I already started in on this story, and who got to this point of trying to figure out how to counsel in a little different way. And so after meeting with people for a time, if he didn't see a change, he would say, I would refuse to pray for them or continue to counsel people who'd come to see me. I believe that it's true so firmly that there have been times when I have refused to pray for people. Now that sounds harsh and mean and not at all pastoral, but I recognize that they were using prayer requests as a way to camouflage the fact that they weren't willing to access the prayers they had already been answered and the resources that had already been given to them. I needed to help them see that they already had strength, saying, nope, you got this. Stop delaying with more prayer. You've got an answer. You've got resources. Now it's time to move forward. Along the same lines, I've even stopped counseling people before because the longer they hold on to me or any other counselor, the more they're being held back from true, genuine, authentic healing and wholeness. Folks, God doesn't want to enable and prolong bad behavior, and God doesn't want us to be spiritually dependent. God instead wants to empower an army of disciples and apostles. There was an old Methodist preacher by the name of Peter Cartwright in the 1800s, and one Sunday, as he was preparing to preach, his elders came in and said to him, "President Andrew Jackson is here today. Don't say anything to upset him. The president is here." So a bit later that morning, after the opening prayers and the hymns, Cartwright stood up and said something to this effect: "I've been told that President Andrew Jackson is here. I've also been advised to temper my remarks so as not to offend. Well, here it goes. Andrew Jackson will die and go to hell just like everybody else if he doesn't repent and believe in the gospel." And Andrew Jackson's response? He invited him to dinner. So it worked out all right. I wish I could have met Peter Cartwright, because it's clear that he was about telling people what they need to hear and to empower life change, not what they wanted to hear that would enable self-destruction, just like the God we meet in Judges. Folks, God knows what needs to happen, and God will not let the Israelites' complaints or Gideon's questions manipulate him into deviating from the plan to empower Gideon. God will not be manipulated, which means I have to ask you, do you have a manipulative relationship with God? It's the kind of relationship in which you only call on God when you're in a bind. There's a constant temptation for us to ask God for help in our dilemmas without repenting of what maybe got us in those dilemmas in the first place. Help me, we cry, and sometimes through a delay or struggle, God has to withhold help in order to empower us to grow. It's as if God says to us sometimes, stop waiting for the next answered prayer and start acting on the already answered prayer. Folks, God doesn't want to enable us. He wants to empower us. And for us, that takes a step of faith, a leap of faith sometimes, trusting that God's already placed within us what we need to be able to move forward. Let us pray.